Hi guys, welcome to this Matchbook Extra. July's newsletter theme is 2 books I wouldn't normally read. And so I picked a horror book as one of those. So I read It by Stephen King. And I challenged myself to, if I got through the book, I would watch both of the movies. And so I was thinking, what medium is scarier, a book or a movie? And I thought it'd be really fun to have a discussion about it. So with me, I have my wonderful writer, actor, director friend, Anthony Raus, who mainly focuses on horror movies.
That's right.
So we're gonna discuss that today. The first question, and I think I'll ask it and then I'll count to 3 and we can both answer at the same time.
Okay.
What's scarier, a book or a movie? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Movie.
Film.
Okay, yeah.
It's
So
yeah.
why?
Well, okay, so it's, I mean, technically, you could argue that either or is, like, scary in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think, well, film is a visual medium.
Yeah.
So you take it's like driving along a set of train tracks with an unstable driver. The person is the one living out the events and you are along for the ride. If you're reading a book and you get to a part that you don't want to, you can close the book, set it down, come back to it whenever. It's like you're reading at your own pace. You're living through the events.
And I would agree with that because I was thinking about that too, because you can walk away from a book, and with a movie, especially if you're seeing it in theaters, you can't just escape that. You've paid money, you're stuck in there for 2.5 hours along for the ride. I was thinking, the two big things that came up for me as to why a movie would be scarier is music and pacing. Because I remember, so we went to acting school together, and our first year we had a viewpoints class. And I remember in one of those classes, my teacher, Sarah, she did an example where she just like crossed the room and exited through the door. And then she did it again, but halfway there she stopped and she like looked around, and then she like crept up to the door and then like paused with her hand on the handle, and the tension in the room just skyrocketed. So I think that was like a really good example of like how just like movement and pacing of something can absolutely change the tension, and I think you definitely get that in a film rather than a book. And also music, or even just silence in a movie, you're like, oh yeah, something's coming.
Oh, totally.
Like 100%. So like, but I think in a book, there's certain details that you get, like all of the descriptions of like its different forms in Stephen King's book was super detailed and like definitely disgusting. Like when like it's Eddie, right, who comes across the leper in the house. So I remember reading that, and there was just so much detail because you have to give like a step-by-step description of what something looks like in a book. While in a film, you sort of get it right when it appears. Well,
and in a book, you're also painting the picture.
Yeah.
The picture's painted for you when you watch a film. And so it's like, you can think up sometimes your brain can come up with the most horrifying things, even more than a film can.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting when it comes to.
And that was one of the things, because before I started reading it, my aunt was telling me, oh, it's like so scary because your imagination can just go wild. And I think there's validity to that, but I also think with a movie, at least for me, because I don't watch horror movies that often, is that the movie sort of stays with me and then my imagination like goes everywhere. And I think sometimes there's something to be said with not showing everything in a horror movie. And I think now there's a lot of horror movies that it's sort of like, oh, let's have blood everywhere and let's make it scary in this way, versus like jump scares. And I think a good example of it is the movie Alien with Sigourney Weaver. The first one versus like Alien Covenant, which I didn't really like that much because there was so much gore and blood thrown into my face as to how people were dying, versus the first one where they didn't really need to show it. You just sort of, especially when the captain's like in the tunnel and you just see like the alien, and then it's like you don't see him go anywhere. You don't need to. So, is there like a certain formula for like horror movies now that they follow that you use in your work, or?
I mean, I think whether you intentionally do it or unintentionally do it, there's a formula that can be, whether consciously done or not consciously done, you are in the back of your head thinking about other films when you make a film.
Right.
Like even back to Jaws. If you look at Jaws, you don't see the it for the majority of the movie, and you get the POV shots and all that, and that's used in everything. I use it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where what your mind can think up is sometimes more terrifying than what you're going to see on the screen.
Right. Yeah.
And that's going back to the books, like reading a book and a horror story. Sometimes the picture you paint in your brain can be 10 times more terrifying than what you see on screen. Because I was more scared of the shark when you didn't see it. When you see it at the end, it's like, oh yeah, it's a big shark.
Right.
It's a big shark, but...
Yeah. I think that's true, because I think in both like the book and the movie, the more I saw Pennywise, the less I was terrified, because it's almost like the shock sort of wears off almost.
Right.
So especially when I was reading the book, I was sort of like halfway through, I was like, okay, I want to see Pennywise again. Like, I'm sort of ready to see these scenes. I want to know like where it goes. You know, I was sort of getting excited about it. And I think it's definitely true with, I think so many people watch so many movies now that certain things become predictable almost. And so it's like, you know, if you see someone who's walking down a dark hallway and there's just like silence all of a sudden, you're like, oh, something's coming.
Right.
Or if all of a sudden there's like a close-up shot and they're not showing you what's behind somebody, you know the next wide shot, there's going to be something there.
Totally.
And I wonder if that's like a strength or not, because I think psychologically it could work, because the audience then goes, oh, I know something's coming, and then they get more anxious knowing that something's coming.
I think it can work. It can be scarier if you show something but don't acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. Like if you just have two people acting in a scene, and you see something in the background, whatever, you know, a shadow or whatever projected on the wall, but you don't acknowledge it. The person doesn't turn around, the person doesn't notice it. Like if you have a scene where there's a woman at a counter making coffee, and you just see someone in a mask creeping behind her, and then you cut to a close-up of her pouring the coffee, cut back to the wide shot, and the person's not there, you don't acknowledge it at all.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's worse than if she turns around, sees it, and then there's a whole like chase scene.
Yeah. So do you keep that in mind when you're writing a horror movie, like how you're gonna sort of make it scary, or do you sort of wait until you're in director mode for that?
If it services the shot,
okay.
If there's like a shot where, you know, there's a shot in a film I just made that's literally that. It's a shot of a woman's face, and the camera slowly shifts over, and you see someone behind her. If it's something like that, then definitely it's intentional.
Yeah.
But when I, you know, send the film off to the composer, and they'll put in music for jump scares that I didn't even know were there.
Oh, that's awesome.
That I was like, there's a moment there that I didn't catch. But
yeah.
that's I think that's interesting when it shows the like collaborative nature.
Right.
When it comes to making a film, because it's like, oh, I didn't catch something, but.
Right, but now the music
But
helps
now the
support
music
that.
is there, and it's like, oh, that's amazing.
Wow. I wouldn't have thought about that, because I know music is really important,
Right.
but it's also like I wouldn't have thought that, you know, that the music itself could point out a jump scare opportunity for you as a director to like capitalize on to scare people. So, what in your opinion makes for a good, like a strong horror movie?
I've never been super into... I'm into the aesthetic of horror films. I'm not particularly interested in the scares.
Okay.
I'm interested in the tension that gets you to the scare.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
I mean, if there's... The most important lesson I've learned as a filmmaker is the greatest gift you can give to an audience is building up the tension, relieving them of the tension, and then 2 seconds later building it up again.
Okay, yeah.
Within 3 seconds of of what they're witnessing, because it shows that you have them. They're in your grasp. You're puppeteering an audience to feel. And I mean, it's true of any genre. If you make an audience laugh in a comedy, you've accomplished your goal. If you make them cry in a drama,
yeah. But
I feel like horror genre is very interactive, especially when people are doing stuff on, like, you're like, oh, don't. You're not in a comedy yelling at the screen for people to do something funny.
Right.
It's much more of a communal thing when you're sitting in a theater with a group of people and you're all getting scared.
I would agree with that. I think because when I went to go see Get Out, it was with a full audience, and
that's
that
the best
really
way to
helped.
See it.
Because it's a great movie, but it sort of brings it to another level when you're in a room with everybody who's feeling the same way that you do.
Right.
So is there a certain way that you try to keep like jump scares like fresh so that like your audience isn't sort of getting numb to the scares?
I don't use them just to use them. If I use a jump scare, it's to serve the purpose of the story I'm telling. If there's a shadow projected on the wall, or there's a monster creeping into the bedroom, it's not just to have a monster creeping in the bedroom or a shadow projected on the wall. It's because in order for the story to continue, that needs to happen. And I think again the build is better than the payoff.
Right. Yeah. And I think
the minute you satisfy an audience with a jump scare, they're like, and you don't want that.
Right.
As like, you don't want that every other second. You want them on the edge of their seat, clawing at themselves, not to, have that feeling. Because people like to get scared. They don't like the build up to the creepy noise. They like seconds after the creepy noises happen, so they can be like, oh man.
Okay, yeah.
So it's like. I think that's what I find so interesting, and that's why I try not to use them too heavily. Like,
there has to be like a reason for it.
Right, and for me, one of the scariest moments in it happens whenever the book, not the is when any moment where the town is just so blind and so willing to not accept what's happening and just ignoring everything. That is so frightening to me, because you're living amongst ignorant people who are just not gonna acknowledge you, or not. They know what's going on, but they're under the like
they
the
sort
visor
of
it. So that's one of the scariest moments in the and it's in the film too, but it's done much better in the book. So that's one thing where I think, in one instance where I think the book did a great service in terms of scaring you without throwing the clown in your face. Right. Which the film has to very much do. Yeah. To give you the payoff.
Yeah, it definitely has that like sense of reality where it almost isolates you more, even though like you're in a town full of people, because there's just people. Because I remember there's a scene in the book where I think it's Beverly. She like calls for help or whatever, and she sees like her neighbor just sort of go back into the house, and she realizes she's alone, even though she has neighbors and all this stuff, because these people just aren't either like they're not seeing what's happening, or they're just not willing to help her in that situation. And that's one of the things in the book, and I think it's because you don't have enough time in a film to really make someone care about the characters, because there's a lot more time to sort of lay their background. And so at the end, spoiler alert, when Eddie dies, I was super affected by it, and I really didn't expect to get that upset about one of these characters dying. And I think it's because in the book you just had so much time to see them through their childhood, and then also see how events in their childhood sort of manifested in their adult life as well. And so you spend so much more time. And so in the movie, I care about the characters, but I don't think I would have cared about them as much had I not read the book and had already formed opinions and known who these characters were before seeing them, you know?
Yeah.
That might be like one of the weaknesses of like horror movies. It's just it might just be a time thing where it's certain horror movies are much more about like the scariness versus like the character driven plot, you know?
Yeah, and the book has 1,100 pages. The movie has 2 hours.
Exactly.
To kind of
get
everything. Well, and I mean, I guess you could say 1,100 pages cut in half because it's
right.
Cause
which I thought was a really good idea for the new version because you got to spend more time.
It wasn't like
exactly because the 90s version was very true to the book in a lot of aspects, but certain things sort of felt rushed, even though it was a 3-hour movie, right. You know, because they had to sort of cover 2 different time frames in 3 hours. That's supposed to span like, you know, 30 years basically. One thing I will say is that in the movies, which I think was a smart change, is that they don't dive into what it actually is.
Right.
And you do get that explanation in the book, and I understand why, because there is a bigger message, and I understand it, but I was a little bit, I don't want to say I was disappointed, but it was more like, I felt like I didn't need it.
Right.
I was prepared to accept that there was this crazy shape-shifting immortal clown that just happens that just happens to live in Derry. I didn't really need to know where it came from, why it came from, or like anything like that. And I think, you know, it makes it so that they have to change, you know, the final battle, if you will, at the end. But I think ultimately, I think it's stronger instead of sort of getting into that existential, you know.
Well, that's interesting about the final battle, because both, I haven't read the book in years, but when they're children and when they're adults, they did this in the 90s version, it manifests into a giant spider.
Yes.
And the thing I like about the 2017 film is that it was constantly changing as it was fighting off all the kids to adapt to their fears. It wasn't just one entity. It was not evolving. It was shifting depending on the need to survive and I thought that was really, really well done. I do miss. We were talking about this. I do miss the silver bullet aspect because, you know, I mean, in the 80s and 90s, like the Wolfman, the Frankenstein's monsters, like Dracula, were all killed off by silver bullets, and it's. And I know what Stephen King wanted to do when he was writing this, he said in an interview, was that it was like his final exam to becoming a horror author because he was going to incorporate all the monsters. Yeah. And so I think that would have been nice to have the silver bullet slingshot aspect to them as kids. But, you know, I think the way they did it was serviceable.
I would agree. I think even though certain aspects were a little bit farther away from the book, I think thematically, overall, it definitely lines up with the book a lot more. And I think that's what makes a good adaptation in general. Anyway, is like as long as you can change things, but as long as the overall theme and the message lines up, it still feels like a good adaptation. It still feels like the same project. Right,
and you're not putting the book on film. Right. You're delivering it to this audience, an audience that might not ever pick up a book. Right. An audience that wants a serviceable horror film, something quick, something effective, but not necessarily someone that might pick up a Stephen King book and want to read 1,100 pages and sit through all the descriptions and all the
and all
character development, all the good stuff.
Yes.
But I understand why they chop stuff up and take stuff out and.
For sure. I think as long as you're keeping the spirit of the project alive, I think that's really important, and I think that's why it's such a important thing that they did split this film into 2 in order to cover both bases and sort of, because it gives them more room and more time, you know, that they don't really have to develop these characters, you know, over a longer period of time. So then you're getting like 4 hours worth of character development, you know, versus like, you know, 1.5 here and 1.5 here.
Right.
So which one is scarier, the 90s version or the 2017 version?
As a film, or as the, like, which clown is scarier?
Either.
As a whole?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, the Tim Curry version scared me a lot as a kid. I saw it maybe when I was about 5 or 6, and it really, really messed me up. I watch it now, and I'm like, oh, memories. It doesn't scare me.
Yeah.
I went into the 2017 version, and I mean, it didn't scare me, but it did a pretty good job of, and that's me as an adult. There were some moments where I was like, can I swear?
Yes.
Oh shit. I was like,
Right.
What the fuck? And it's I think that's that kind of the definitive, that's the purpose of Pennywise and it, or whatever it is. And so I think for it to scare me as an adult, I got to go with the 2017 version, but the 90s version is a good series. Yeah. And I like it a lot.
For me, it was, I think the 90s version is more jump scary, while the newer version is a lot more like fucked up kind of scary.
Yeah.
And, you know, going into watching the 90s version, because I love Tim Curry, you know, I adore Rocky Horror Picture Show, so I was like, okay, this is just like Frankenfurter dressed up as a clown, it's fine, like, you know, and you could just tell how much fun he was having, you know, but I think also it's like, you know, there's a slight disadvantage of comparing the two because the special effects are very different. So, you know, there was sort of, they both have the thing where, you know, it, you know, sort of grows this huge mouth of teeth and all that stuff, and they could sort of do more things with it with Bill Skarsgård versus what they could do with Tim Curry, just because, you know, technology is so much better.
Right.
But also, I think, one of the things, and this was such a small detail, and I didn't really pick it up until seeing quite a few scenes with Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise, is that his eyes don't face the same way.
One's like slightly
off. And it gives you this, I was like, there's something really creepy. Besides the fact that
like he's not
entirely
paying attention to you.
Yeah, there's
and like this side's like focused on the food. And
they're just slightly off center of each other, and it just sort of, even if you don't pick up on it, like, oh, it's his eyes, it's just, there's something off, there's something creepy, you know, something's really weird about this, and it sort of puts you, you know, it unnerves you, like, you know, sort of right off the bat.
Oh, jeez.
Plus, not only that, but Bill Skarsgård is, you know, I'm sure he's a wonderful human being, but he's very good at looking creepy. Yeah. Even without the makeup. Like, he can sort of flip this switch and, like, something, there's, like, a weird sparkle in his eye, and you're like, oh, he can kill me. Like, okay.
Right.
So, I think when you add, you know, makeup and special effects onto that, it just sort of brings together this, you know, incredible performance that I'm also sure he had so much fun with, because how could you not, really? But, and also, like, Bill Skarsgård is just, he's, like, super tall and, like, super talented, and, like, I think it was the scene where Georgie, after his brother, like, shoots him in the head, and he like starts like convulsing on the floor, and the legs just all of a sudden fly out like easily 5 feet longer than they were.
So
it was like, oh my god, he's like a monster compared to these kids that are like 12 and like, you know, probably my height, but you know, whatever. So it's just like, I think that adds to it, and I think, and I also think that Tim Curry's It sort of has, he talks to you more.
And cracked a lot of jokes.
You know, he's sort of a little bit more persuasive, and Bill Skarsgård's version, like, after the initial, like, interaction with Georgie, he sort of, like, you know, he'll say hello, he'll offer you a balloon, but then he'll just stare at you.
Right.
With, like, and not even with a smile, his face just goes.
And his, like, mouth is, like, drooling because he's hungry.
And you're like, okay, okay. I'm gonna get out of here right now. Like,
yeah. Like, I could understand climbing into the sewer after Tim Curry's to play with and, like, have some cotton candy and ride the rides and stuff. I wouldn't get anywhere near Skarsgård's Pennywise ever. I am not enticed by that clown at all. Well, like, they say it in the book, like Georgie could slowly hear, like, the rumblings of the circus rides and, like, from the sewer. And I don't care what Bill Skarsgård's got down there. I'm not climbing in that sewer. Whereas I got more of a clown vibe from from Tim Curry.
Yeah, and I almost think that the movie, both of them, sort of could have done a little bit of a better job of sort of making that moment where Georgie does, like, smell popcorn and hear carnival rides. And so I think they could have built that up a little bit so we as an audience could also hear it and, like, be tempted as well and be like, oh, there is a circus down there. So,
well, that's what I liked about the scene with Beverly in the bathroom in the new one, and she hears the voices just coming from the drain, and it's
there was something about that scene where, you know, because I know, you know, that, like, blood comes out of the sink, but there was, like, so much of it.
So much.
Where, like, even, like, the lighting was red in the bathroom afterward. That sort of felt like a very old school horror movie. Where she was just, like, covered and, like, sitting in the corner. It, like, felt very much like an old school kind of horror movie in that scene, at least, which I thought was, like, really cool and, like, definitely disgusting. But, like, you know, I think it was a nice little, like, throwback little touch toward, like, horror movies of, you know, past.
And one of my favorite, not scary scenes, one of my favorite just moments with the Losers Club in the book is when they help Beverly clean up her bathroom. And in the 90s film, it's just blood, like, along the edges of the sink and, like, a little bit on the floor. And, you know, I could see Beverly, she wouldn't ignore it, but I could see her, like, pretending it wasn't there. With the blood in the new one, there's no way she could set foot in that bathroom and not be traumatized.
Right.
So the urgency for them to come over and help her is higher, and I think that was what made it more like, oh, they're friends. They're in this together. Lucky Seven, you know, that type of thing. But yeah, that's, I think.
Yeah, one thing I did miss though is their like their clubhouse that they built.
Yeah.
I did miss that a lot.
I don't think they spent enough time in the Barrens in the new film.
No, you're right. And I, you know, they don't even build the dam in this new version, which is sort of like their whole big bonding moment. Right. And there were also, you know, like Eddie doesn't have his, like, asthma attack and anything like that. So that was like a big change, but yeah, I think you're right that they didn't really spend enough time in this place where, you know, they're like where their friendship really grows, you know, and I think that's one of the things where it's like there are certain things that are farther away from the book and certain things that are closer to the book, and, you know, I think the old version, because it was following the book so closely, I could sort of mentally prepare myself as to when it was gonna appear, because I could sort of follow it in my head. And it doesn't really do that in this new one, even though, like, a lot of things are stronger. But there were I sort of missed having each of the kids have their own interaction with it, you know, in like they do in the book before they all sort of come together.
Yeah, like you saw it too. It's like that's like the glue that holds them together. Is joint trauma.
Right. Wonderful.
Yeah, totally. So you and we talked about, like, the ignorance of the people in Derry. What do you think about Henry Bowers?
In this new version?
In the book, the new version, and the 90s series.
So, It shocked me as to how old he looked in this new movie, because I had always figured that he was older. The same age.
Oh.
You know? I never, I sort of pictured him as, like, maybe a year older, but, you know, still just, like, an asshole. I never really saw him as, like, an older teenager that was, like, picking on these kids.
That's so funny.
Yeah. But, and I think they did spend more time in this movie with Henry and, like, with, like, the influence of, like, his father and stuff, but I felt like they sort of could have, like, they could have spent more time showing his, like, descent into madness, almost, because as an, like, he ends up in a psych ward and, like, has to, like,
I don't know
escape,
how they're gonna do that, because in this film he falls down, like, the well and, like, bangs off the sides.
Right, that's true. I didn't think about that. And, like, especially, like, because I remember when, in the book, you know, all of the interactions with Henry, they get more violent, and even his friends start to realize, like, this guy's crazy.
Not joking around,
like, you know, like, you can't just, like, cut, like engrave your name into this kid's stomach. Like, that's insane.
I mean, you can.
Right. You can. It's just, like, you know.
Not cool.
It's frowned upon. But I think, and you know, one of the things that surprised me was I was like, okay, they're spending more time with, like, Henry, and in the book, they talk about how he took the blame for all of the murders. Right. And they didn't show that in this film.
Well, no, and, like, that's the whole thing. Like, he gets hypnotized. Doesn't he get hypnotized by the deadlights?
I think so.
And that kind of, like, turns his hair white, and he...
Yeah, no, you're right. And that definitely happens in the 90s version.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought that was kind of...
Yeah, because I think what happens is that he's already, like, slightly unhinged in the book.
He goes down there to kill them, doesn't he?
Yeah, and then, like, it sort of talks to him, like, through, like, the moon. In the book. Yeah. It's like he sort of, like, gets messages from, like, the moon, and I think that's how, like, it was, like, communicating with him. And I'm pretty sure in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, they're already running away from Henry Bowers when they decide to go into the drain system. Either that or Henry, like, appears while they're doing it, and then he follows them down there.
Right.
And that's sort of how he ends up down there and, like, you know, tries to, like, you know, go after them and, like, kill them. So that was, like, surprising to me. It was that they didn't spend as much time showing his descent into madness, and also not showing that he took the blame for all of these murders, because it's definitely when they're older, you know, it sort of comes back to them as, like, you gotta kill them because they're, like, coming back, and, you know, he wants to weaken them as much as possible. Right.
Well, and, like, I mean, I feel like Henry in the 90s series was way too West Side Story. He was way too leather jacket. And
right.
Well, I think that's how he's described in the book. But it's still, it's looking at it now, I mean, he doesn't look like the son of a cop.
Right.
But we never see any of that in the miniseries, so I guess it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this discussion. July's newsletter will be out on July 10th. And Anthony, what are you working on? Where can everybody find you?
Okay, so what's going on now? I have a film coming out late summer called Abstraction. That's what we're working on right now. It'll probably be on VOD in July, and then Blu-ray in August.
Awesome.
So look for that. I post everything on my Facebook page, and you can follow me on IMDb. That's where pretty much it. I don't really use Twitter. I have a Twitter, don't really use it. Okay. But it's there. All right. I have an Instagram. That's there too.
Awesome. Yeah. I will put all of Anthony's information down below, and I am also releasing a reaction video to the 1990s version of It, which you've seen. Yeah, I have. So if you guys need a laugh, definitely check that out, and be sure to sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. Those of you who sign up through my website will get access to the episodes 24 hours before everyone else, as well as an extra entry in any giveaways that I do in the future. So I will see you guys then.